All right, well, thank you very much. If any of you have been looking at the pictures on the screen, which are almost all my photos, you know that I'm rather fond of trains, which is kind of ironic because I'm not fond of train subsidies. I tell people I don't want other people to subsidize my hobbies, but this particular locomotive is the third most powerful operating steam locomotive in the world, and I help restore it. I'm also an ardent cyclist. I cycle thousands of miles per year. I've never commuted to work by car. I've always bicycled. Occasionally I've relied on transit, but almost always bicycle. Now I work at home, so I do my bicycling and more as recreation, but still prefer cycling over other modes of transportation. Now, it turns out the United States and the world is on the verge of a new transportation revolution. To understand this revolution, it's important to understand the history of transportation in the United States. And that history is about 2 centuries ago, pretty much everybody was confined to foot or horseback or floating on boats, maybe with wind power. Very few people in the history of the world had ever traveled faster than a horse could run and lived to tell about it. And yet, within the next century, we developed the steam-powered steamboat, we developed canals, we developed the steam train, we developed the safety bicycle, and we developed the electric streetcar. Each of these introduced a new revolution in transportation that reduced costs and increased speeds and made a big difference for a lot of people. And yet, by roughly 100 years ago, say 1915, most Americans still were not using any of these forms of transportation. They were still relying on foot or horseback because they couldn't afford it. All of these other forms of transportation, trains, streetcars, even safety bicycles, were expensive. Most Americans lived in rural areas. They didn't have good roads to bicycle on, so they relied on foot or horseback, and most Americans never traveled more than 50 miles from their home in their entire lives. Or if they did, they traveled once to move away from home and then never again traveled. Then, 102 years ago, next week actually, or next month, Henry Ford started building Model T Fords on a moving assembly line. This enabled him to double worker pay and cut the price of his cars in half. And that made it possible for more and more people to get automobiles. When he started, less than 5% of Americans had cars. By 1925, more than 50% of American families had a car. And this revolutionized mobility throughout the United States and eventually throughout the world. You can look at what's happened. It's had enormous impacts on our economy and our lives. Look at how per capita incomes just started shooting up after 1915. As more and more people had more mobility, that meant you could find more jobs. That meant employers could find more highly skilled workers. That meant manufacturers could get products to markets a lot better. It greatly increased our productivity. It also increased home ownership because people who were confined to living in homes within walking distance of where they worked could suddenly go to the urban fringe and buy cheap land and build a small house. And it turns out working class people were more interested in owning their own homes than middle class people. So working class people did everything they could to avoid the regulations and density of the downtown areas and moved into the suburbs and bought homes. Now, we couldn't have things like Costco, Walmart, supermarkets, shopping malls without cars. Cars are an integral part of our world, and they've made a huge difference for everybody. You wouldn't have, the average grocery store in 1915 had about 300 different products on its shelves. Today, 20,000 is about average, and there's some that have close to 100,000 different products on their shelves. So all of these revolutions, the steamboat, the steam train, the streetcar, the automobile, and so on and so forth, made a big difference to society. The automobile the biggest by far, but why did they do it? Well, Paul asked me what we should call this talk, and I came up with something boring like the future of transportation in Albuquerque. But later, I didn't think of this until later. I should have called it Sex in the Single Occupancy Vehicle, because what really makes transportation work is sex. And by sex, I mean speed, economy, convenience, and safety. Each of these new kinds of transportation were faster, cheaper, more convenient, and safer than what preceded them. And when you introduce new kinds of transportation that have sex, you're going to have economic growth and economic value. When you introduce new kinds of transportation that don't have sex, you're not going to get that growth or value. For example, in 1956, Congress created the interstate highway system, and over the next 2 decades, we've built 40,000 miles of interstate highways. These 40,000 miles of interstate highways make up 1% of all the lane miles of roads in this country, and yet they carry 1/4 of all passenger travel and pretty much 1/4 of all highway travel, 20% of all passenger travel, including everything, airlines, railroads, everything. And they carry about 20% of all freight as well. So the interstate highway system had sex. It's faster, it's cheaper, it's more convenient, and it's safer. Driving on interstate is the safest place, especially an urban interstate, is the safest place you can drive, and there's almost no transportation that's safer than an urban interstate in terms of fatalities per billion passenger miles. On the other hand, people have proposed, President Obama has proposed building a high-speed rail system. The problem is high-speed rail doesn't have sex. It's faster than driving, but it's far less convenient. It's slower than flying, and no more convenient than flying. And it's far more expensive than either one. Right now, a ticket price on an Amtrak Acela is about 75 cents a passenger mile on the average, whereas the cost of driving on the average is about 24 cents a passenger mile. When you add the subsidies, the high-speed rail becomes even less efficient compared to driving or flying, which are both about 15 to 25 cents a passenger mile with subsidies. So driving and flying are the cheap forms of travel. Rail is, for passenger, is the expensive form, which is why it doesn't work very well. Other countries that have built high-speed rail systems that are touted as being successful, they were successful because most of the passengers came from low-speed rail systems. Japan, for example, in 1950, 92% of all travel in Japan was by rail. By the time they built their high-speed rail line that opened in 1964, 72% was still by rail. Within 5 years, it had declined to 50%. Today, it's around 25%. So high-speed rail was only successful because it got people out of low-speed trains. It didn't get anybody out of their cars, and in fact, it didn't even slow down. It may even have accelerated the movement of people from trains to cars because high-speed trains were so expensive, some people couldn't afford them, and cars were just cheaper. In the United States, Amtrak's subsidies are threatened by megabus. How many people here have seen a megabus? They're not very common in the West yet, but they're very common in the Midwest, the South, and the Northeast. It's actually a British company. It was a public transit agency, and Britain privatized their transit. And the privatized company said, we have to figure out a way to be more efficient, so they developed these double-decker buses. They don't have bus stations. You buy your tickets online, and the first ticket they sell costs $1.50. And then the second ticket's $1.50, and then it goes up to $3.50, $5.50, and so on. So a one-way ticket from Washington, D.C. to New York on Amtrak's high-speed Acela is $150. I once went round trip on Megabus for about $15. And it's become very successful in a lot of corridors. Buses are carrying more people than Amtrak at a lower cost and growing faster than Amtrak as well. And this provides lessons for our urban transit. The first lesson is don't rely on infrastructure. Use the shared infrastructure we already have, like megabuses uses streets and roads and highways. but they don't have train station or bus stations, they don't have ticket offices, they don't have baggage facilities and so on. So they rely on shared infrastructure, not dedicated infrastructure. And yet, there's a lot of people who say we need to improve urban transit by building more dedicated infrastructure, such as this streetcar line that was being proposed along Central Avenue in Albuquerque a few years ago. Well, now some people think we're better off talking about bus rapid transit instead of streetcars, but look, the streetcar shares the lane with the cars. The proposed bus rapid transit will not share lanes with cars, so it's actually going to be worse than the streetcars. Here's the proposed bus rapid transit. Notice we've got an exclusive BRT lane. People say, oh, Central Avenue is congested, so we need to relieve that congestion by getting more buses out there. Well, it only will relieve congestion if you get people riding those buses. Right now, parts of Central Avenue has 6 lanes of traffic plus 2 left turn lanes, and the proposal is to reduce it to 4 lanes of traffic and no left turn lanes plus 2 exclusive bus lanes. And the city paid Parsons Brinkerhoff a bunch of money to do an analysis of what that's going to do to traffic congestion, and they were very upfront about it. It's going to make congestion a lot worse because of reducing the capacity, the number of lanes on Central Avenue. So anytime a BRT proponent says, oh, we're going to relieve congestion by getting people to ride the buses, quote them their own study that says exactly the opposite. They're definitely going to increase congestion. Now, you already have bus rapid transit. It's called Rapid Ride, and it doesn't use exclusive bus lanes. And it works perfectly fine without exclusive bus lanes. If you want to make it better, if you want to make it faster, what you do is you have people pay before they get on the bus. That reduces the amount of what's called dwell time, the amount of time the bus has to stop at each stop, by at least 50%. You pay before you get on, and then you just walk on the bus. You don't have to. You can open up all the doors, and everybody can get on every door, and you don't have to wait for people to fumble for change or wave their card or whatever. That's the next step in bus rapid transit, and that's really all the far you have to go. You don't need to have exclusive lanes until you have the point where you've got 500,000 jobs in downtown Albuquerque, and you've got 50% of them are taking transit to work. Then it might make sense to have exclusive lanes. But you don't have that condition now. If you want to attract more people, you give them more amenities, like free Wi-Fi. Maybe even serve coffee and Starbucks coffee and donuts. There are new private bus operations in the San Francisco Bay Area that are providing free Starbucks coffee and donuts on their buses and attracting people to pay $5 to ride their buses instead of the $1 or whatever it is to ride the San Francisco Muni. The next step is to exclusive lanes. This is almost always a waste. This is in Los Angeles, which has 132,000 jobs downtown, nowhere near enough to support an exclusive bus lane. They spent $20 million a mile building exclusive bus lanes. Do you see any buses? No. Why not? Because even at rush hour, they only run a bus on these lanes once every 8 minutes. That means these lanes are empty 98.8% of the time. You don't need to dedicate these lanes to something that's only going to be there once every 8 minutes. These should be opened up to cars, bicycles, other kinds of traffic in addition to buses. Now, the next argument they make is that transit improvements generate economic development. This is a big lie spread by my former hometown of Portland, Oregon, which I left in 1998, and I hope I never have to go back. Portland's a great place to visit because it has a lot of young people who don't know how to cook, and so they eat out a lot. It has a very high percentage of restaurants, and it's got some other amenities I'll get into later, but the transit isn't one of them. Portland built its first light rail line in 1986. Oh, excuse me, that's not Portland. Anytime I see an orange and white light rail train in front of an ugly apartment building, I think it's Portland, but that's actually Moscow. Here's Portland. The difference is that in Portland it's raining, and in Moscow it's sunny. But I don't want to say nobody rides the light rail in Portland, but one time there was a train came into the downtown Portland that only had one passenger on board. Now, coyotes like to go where they know they can find solitude from people. It turns out there's actually several stops where coyotes and raccoons routinely got on the train and hung out because better solitude than hanging around with all the people at the parks when they're getting on. Anyway, in 1980, Portland had a bus system. No trains, no bus rapid transit. It was just buses. 9.9% of all commuters in the Portland area took the bus to work in 1980. Then they built 5 light rail lines. They built a commuter rail line. They built 2 streetcar lines. And they built all kinds of high-density, transit-oriented developments, almost all of them heavily subsidized. They gave hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies. This one received $10 million and went bankrupt. They gave him another $10 million and went bankrupt again. They gave him another $10 million, and I think it went bankrupt a third time. After all of this, the percentage of people taking transit to work increased from 9.9 to 7.3. You can see how successful Portland is. It's a great success. Between 2008 and 2013, Portland gained 21,500 new jobs. About half of them drive to work, about half of them bicycle and walk to work, and negative 1,000 of them take transit to work. In other words, they lost 1,000 transit commuters. That's how successful Portland Transit is. They're losing transit commuters. You hear about all the people bicycling and walking to work. Those are people who were taking transit, but then they subsidized all this housing downtown, near downtown, and so people there, it's on the streetcar line. They quickly found that you can walk faster than the streetcar, so they're not taking the streetcar line, they're walking or bicycling to work. And by the way, the bicyclists hate the streetcars because 2 out of 3 of them have had their wheels caught and had accidents from getting their wheels caught between the rails. Anyway, back in '86, they built the first light rail line, and they zoned everything along the line for high-density transit-oriented development. 10 years later, this is what they got. Nada, not a thing. A city planner named Mike Saba testified before the city council. If you could hear what he was saying, this is what you would hear. They did not get any transit-oriented developments along the light rail line. Not a single one. So what did? They decided they had to subsidize it. This particular city commissioner, he's now mayor, he proposed all kinds of subsidies, and today they have given about $2 billion in subsidies to developers along the rail lines to get them to develop the area. Then they call it development-oriented transit. They said they'll bring in your mayor or your newspaper editor, and they'll say, look, we built this streetcar line, we got all this new development. Well, it turns out the streetcar line goes through 3 different, what you call TIDs, Tax Increment Development Districts. In Portland, they're called Urban Renewal Districts. And the 3 districts are here, here, and here. There's actually a 4th one down here. So there's 4 different TIDs that the streetcar line goes through. Here is the one place that doesn't get any subsidies. So they tallied up all the new developments they got in these districts. For example, here's that was called the Pearl District, or formally it's called the River District, but the informal name is the Pearl District. And they got a huge number of developments after giving $200 million in subsidies. It used to be a rail yard, so they tore out the railroad tracks. The city put in streets, they put in sewer, they put in water, all the things that developers would normally have to do themselves, and they got things like a Whole Foods. Well, why is there a Whole Foods there? Because of the streetcar line? No, it's because the city built a parking garage for the Whole Foods. They built 10,000 parking garage spaces along the streetcar line, and then they claimed the streetcar generated the economic development. So yes, they got $1.25 billion of economic development in the Pearl District because they gave it hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies. But we go to this district where there are no subsidies, and guess what? All the developments they could find added up to about 17, $18 million. Less than one development in the Pearl District. And these developments, well, here's one. It was a fitness center. It was put right along the streetcar line and went bankrupt after 5 years. And now it's an empty storefront. So the streetcar did not generate the development. The subsidies generated the development. And you can subsidize it without building a streetcar or a bus rapid transit. I don't think you should, but you don't need the streetcar or the bus rapid transit to get to development. What's really made Portland, Portland is not light rail, it's not streetcars, it's beer. Portland opened its light rail line in 1986. In 1985, Oregon became the second state to legalize the sale of beer on the premises in which it was made. Before that, downtown Portland was dead at night. It rolled up the streets at 6 o'clock. By 1990, there were a dozen microbrew pubs downtown. Today, there are 50. There are 75 in the Portland area as a whole. Portland has the highest ratio of microbrew pubs per capita in the country. And that is what's revitalized downtown Portland. Now it's as busy at 11 o'clock at night as at 5 in the afternoon. It's as hard to find parking on Sundays as it is on weekdays because of beer, not because of light rail or anything else. Now you also probably heard about Cleveland's Health Line. Supposedly this line led to billions of dollars in economic development as well. I looked up the Health Line. It was supposed to go, they call it bus rapid transit. It was supposed to go 12 miles an hour. Actually, it turns out it goes 10 miles an hour. That's not very rapid. And the developments, I have a theory that if anybody says to you a particular transit line generated economic development, you go Google the name of that transit line and add the word increment for tax increment financing. I did. This is the Woolworth, former Woolworth store, was developed into a beautiful little shopping area along the Health Line. It received $110 million in tax increment financing. The bus rapid transit didn't generate this, the $110 million did. And you go down the list of all the other developments, they all received some kind of subsidies, often TIF, often other subsidies such as tax credits and so on and so forth. So you're not going to get downtown revitalization, you're not going to get Central Avenue revitalization, you're going to get Central Avenue destruction because of the bus rapid transit line. We have spent, as a society, close to $1 trillion subsidizing transit since 1970, and per capita transit ridership has fallen by 20%. Spending money on transit doesn't work, especially spending money on fixed infrastructure, which is really expensive and expensive to maintain as well. In fact, cities that spent the most on transit in the 1990s grew the slowest in the 2000s. You can see here's slowest population growth among the cities that spent the most on transit capital improvements. The cities that grew fastest in the 2000s were the cities that were spending the least on transit. Now there's a lot of things that influence growth, but it's pretty clear that spending more on transit, if anything, reduces growth because it adds to the tax burden and leads people to go somewhere else other than your community. Now Albuquerque is, it's really surprising that anybody's debating this because transit is pretty much insignificant here. Less than 1% of all passenger travel goes by transit. Less than 1.8% of commuters take transit to work. And that's for all commuters. Now about 5,000 people in Albuquerque have jobs and don't have a single car in their household. How do they get to work? About 20% of them take transit to work, but 40% of them drive alone. How do they drive alone if they don't have cars? Well, maybe it's an employer-supplied car or a borrowed car, I don't know. The point is, transit doesn't even work in Albuquerque for the people who don't have cars. And you're not going to make it work better by putting in a bunch of infrastructure on one transit corridor. If you want it to work better, you need smaller transit vehicles going to more places, not bigger vehicles going to fewer places. We say, oh, we need transit to help the poor. Well, it turns out the income group that is most likely to use transit are the people who earn $75,000 a year or more, not the poor. Most poor people in this country have figured out they need a car if they want to have a job. And so they go out and get a car. Very few poor people don't have cars. And if you want to help somebody who's poor, the best thing you can do is to give them a car, give them an old beater car, rather than give them a free transit pass or something like that. How about we need to have transit to save energy because it's green, right? Well, that might have been true in 1970 when cars were gas guzzlers and they used a lot of energy per passenger mile, and transit was very energy efficient. But since then, cars have become a lot more energy efficient, and because we've built transit lines out into suburbs where nobody's riding them, transit has gotten less energy efficient. Today, if you ride an ordinary bus in Albuquerque, you're using far more BTUs, far more energy per passenger mile than driving a car. If you ride one of the rapid buses, you're using more BTUs per passenger mile than if you were driving alone in a Hummer. So the rapid buses, they say they're full, but over the course of the day, the average Albuquerque bus, regular bus, has 8 passengers on board. That's about 2/3 of the national average. The rapid buses have an average of 4 passengers on board. So those big, huge buses, accordion buses, have 4 passengers on board. They might be full during rush hour, and the rest of the day they're just empty. Of course, cars are getting more energy efficient very rapidly. By 2025, the average car on the road will be more energy efficient than the most efficient transit system in America. Transit will be the brown form of travel, and people who are real environmentalists, and not just the fake environmentalists who are trying to get more subsidies to transit, will be saying, we need to get rid of transit. That's the brown form of travel. We need to get people out of those transit vehicles and into their cars. Here's a Volvo that's sold in Europe, but not in the United States yet. It's more streamlined than many cars made in the United States. It's diesel powered. It's actually a diesel hybrid. It gets 50 to 60 miles per gallon. That's the average that will be for cars sold in the United States in 2025, 55 miles per gallon. It's easy to do. Manufacturers will not have a problem meeting that just by making cars a little lighter, more streamlined, and diesel powered. Now, the transportation revolution that's going to come is going to appear in about 5 years, and that's driverless cars, self-driving cars. You've probably heard of them. I started talking about them about 6 years ago, and people thought I was nuts, but now Google has driven their self-driving cars, and this is a Google car. 1.8 million miles in California. They've only had 8 accidents, or a dozen accidents, and they're almost all other cars rear-ending their car at a stoplight. Nobody was hurt, very minor damage, and it was always the other car's fault. So getting more self-driving cars will be sexy. It'll allow faster travel, more efficient travel, more convenient travel, and safer travel. One of the benefits is that because self-driving cars will have faster reflexes than human reflexes, you'll be able to increase road capacities by 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 times. Universal mobility. You won't have to have a driver's license anymore. If you're 9 years old or 90 years old, I'm looking forward to putting my dogs in the car and sending them to the vet so I don't have to go. Because it'll be less congestion, it'll be faster, be safer, and it'll be greener. Now, there's a lot of companies that are developing self-driving cars, and you're going to start seeing self-driving things appearing on the market in the next few years. It's predicted that by 2020, you'll be able to buy a fully self-driving car. Notice Uber is on the list. There was a big self-driving car research project at Carnegie Mellon University, and Uber came in and hired away all of their experts, 40 of them. And their goal is to have 500,000 self-driving cars on the road by 2025 that you can share. So you just pull up the Uber app, and within a minute, a car will come to you and pick you up and take you door to door where you want to go. And they say it'll cost less than the cost of owning a car today. I still think a lot of people will want to own cars, but I've been in a self-driving car. This is Google's car in Washington, D.C. We drove in downtown traffic, or excuse me, the car drove in downtown traffic, and we all got to sit back and watch. And I would have no qualms about getting in a self-driving car anywhere. I would certainly have qualms about being driven by some humans I know. So you can actually buy a car today that has several self-driving characteristics. They'll have sensors all over the car that detect other cars. These sensors are to avoid collisions. They have a sensor that detects the car in front of you and maintains the speed of the car in front of you. So you set your car at 80 miles an hour and the car in front of you is going 40 and slows down to 30. Your car will go 40 and slow down to 30. And that's by mimicking the car in front of you, it reduces a lot of congestion right there because, as I say, the faster computer reflexes. Turning a car like this, which you can buy today for about $25,000 into a completely self-driving car, really comes down to installing a couple of new sensors, and a new processor, and a software upgrade. In other words, it costs about as much as a Dell laptop. So whether it will cost that much, certainly they're going to want to get the early adapters and charge more to begin with, but that's really what the cost is going to be. If 20% of cars on the road are using adaptive cruise control, about half of our congestion is going to go away. And as I say, adaptive cruise control has been available since about 2000, 1999. The first cars had adaptive cruise control. By 2017, you'll be able to buy a car that will steer itself. And by this I mean there's several different techniques, but one of them it just watches the stripes in the road, another one it watches the car in front of you and follows that car as long as you want to go where that car is going. By 2020, completely self-driving cars under most conditions, probably eventually all conditions. Right now the only conditions they're having trouble with is when there's snow and ice covering the stripes on the road, which isn't a big problem in New Mexico, but I live in the mountains of Oregon. It's a little bit bigger problem there. By 2030, you'll be able to buy cars that will no longer have a human interface. No steering wheel, no foot pedals or anything like that. And soon after that, people will be saying, I don't want to be on these roads with these human drivers. It's too dangerous. Let's just have cars driving themselves. It'd be a lot safer that way. This is what Volkswagen calls a valet parking car. You'll probably be able to buy cars like this within 2 or 3 years. Basically, you go to work, you go to a restaurant or a hotel, and you tell your car, go park yourself. It'll have a database of all available parking spaces, and it'll drive around until it finds one that's empty, and then it parks itself there. And then when you're done working or done with your meal or whatever, you pull out your smartphone, choose your app, and you say, car, come. And even if you've moved, it zeroes in on your GPS position and comes and picks you up. Now you might not want to do that. You might just want to use car sharing. You want to send your car out to be shared, or you might want to use an Uber car or whatever. We'll probably need only about half the parking spaces we use today. Some people are saying we'll need 90% less, but I don't think it's going to be that much. But it is going to be quite a bit less. Right now, about a third of Americans don't have or don't qualify for driver's licenses because of age or other considerations. This is going to open up mobility for them, so we're going to see a lot more travel. Here's Google's new self-driving car that has no steering wheel, no accelerator pedals, no brake pedals. You just push a button and tell it where you want to go. They are experimenting with this in California. This gentleman is blind, and so they're happy to let him experiment with their self-driving, totally self-driving car. And they haven't decided yet whether they're going to gear up and start building them themselves, or they're just going to sell the software to other manufacturers. Depends on what the manufacturers do, if they're interested in buying the software or what. Apple is rumored to have a self-driving car in development as well, although Apple is very closed-mouthed about what they're wanting to do. Now, about half of Americans say that they don't drive as much as they would like to because they can't afford to. But the other half say the main constraint on their driving is time. If you're in a car and you're having to drive, that takes away from enjoying time with your family, it takes away from being productive at work, it takes away from recreation. Some people find driving to be recreational, but I don't find it recreational, especially if it's in traffic. So if you have a self-driving car driving for you, then that time constraint goes away. And you're going to be willing to live, instead of 30 minutes away from home, 60 minutes or 90 minutes or 2 hours. Because you can sleep on the way, you can work on the way, you can play with your kids on the way to work or on your way home. And That's going to transform the shape of our cities as much as Henry Ford's Model T transformed them in the last century. Some people say that almost all cars will be shared in the future. I'm dubious about that. I think there's a lot of value to having your own cars, your own personal space. You can throw your own junk in it, you can eat your own food in it, play your own music in it, whatever. But maybe they'll make owning a car, for a lot of people, will decide that they want to use sharing instead. I think that's going to have some effects. But even if cars are shared, we'll still need, it's not going to reduce the number of cars needed. Right now, your car is probably in motion about 5% of the time. A shared car is in motion about 75% of the time. But that means it wears out a lot quicker and probably will have a 3-year lifespan instead of a 20-year lifespan like cars today. So Detroit and other manufacturing centers will still be making as many cars, they just won't last as many years. Now what effect is this going to have on places, on cities around the country? Well, Manhattan has most of the nation's transit riders, and they have 2 million jobs located in 7 square miles, and 3 out of 4 of those workers take transit to work. It's simply not going to be possible for self-driving cars to substitute for transit in Manhattan. So you're still going to have a subway system in Manhattan. You're still going to have commuter trains. You might have buses. Probably won't have too many buses because they'll be replaced by self-driving cars. But the subways and the commuter trains will still be there. What about Denver, which is right now spending $8 billion building rail transit all over the place? Denver only has about 120,000 jobs downtown, and most of those people already drive to work. The 20% who take transit could easily be served by self-driving cars, especially considering that self-driving cars are going to reduce congestion a lot. So I don't think transit has a future in Denver. And Denver's decision to put all this money into fixed infrastructure is going to prove to be a huge waste. It's already a huge waste, but this will prove it to even more people that it's a huge waste. Albuquerque, you only have 44,000 jobs downtown. If every single person in Albuquerque who takes transit to work works downtown, that means only 13% of those 44,000 jobs are taking transit to work. Now I think some of that, the people who take transit to work are taking transit to work to other places. So that means less than 13% of downtown job workers are taking transit to work. There's not going to be any need for transit in the future in Albuquerque. Self-driving cars are going to, shared vehicles are going to render it obsolete, especially considering transit costs $1 a passenger mile or more, and the self-driving cars are going to cost between 25 and at most 50 cents a passenger mile. They're probably closer to 25. So putting any money into transit infrastructure is a waste. Continue to run the transit system you've got, but don't put money into infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure do you need for self-driving cars? There are people, mainly manufacturers of electronics, who think that cities should install what's called vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure communications. In other words, when you approach a light, your self-driving car will get an electronic signal saying, this light's red, so stop, or an electronic signal saying somebody's about to enter the intersection, so watch out for them. I don't think that's necessary, and I think that opens up cars and cities to hacking if everybody's using exactly the same vehicle-to-vehicle system. So I'm against cities installing this. It's not necessary. None of the manufacturers of self-driving cars, Google, Volkswagen, none of the people who are experimenting with this are counting on this or assuming it's going to exist at all. Instead, what you should be doing is solving today's problems today. Traffic signal coordination is not politically sexy, but it is sexy. It does make transportation faster, cheaper, and safer, and more convenient. But it's not visible. And so the politicians would rather put your money into things like new infrastructure that they won't be able to afford to maintain, rather than putting it into traffic signal coordination. There's only one city in America that has coordinated all of its signals. If you have to build new roads, here's a cheap way to do it. This is a new freeway built in the median strip of an existing freeway. This median strip was 6 feet wide. They built 3 lanes. In other places, they built 4 lanes of freeway above the existing freeway. It cost $7 million a lane mile. Now that's more than a ground level freeway, but a lot less than a bus rapid transit line, which is what? It's going to be $10 million a mile here? More than $10 million a mile for Albuquerque's bus rapid transit. So this is a way to relieve congestion without taking up a lot of land or condemning right-of-way or whatever. How are you going to pay for it? Well, I like tolls, but I like even better mileage-based user fees. My home state of Oregon was the first state to have a gas tax in 1919 and dedicate it to roads. By 1930, every other state had followed Oregon's example. But the gas tax is on its way out. We aren't driving enough to keep it going. That is, gas taxes the amount of driving we do is increasing slowly, but our cars are getting more fuel efficient very rapidly. So within 20 years, we'll be collecting less gas taxes than we're collecting today. Gas taxes also don't solve problems like funding local roads, because the gas taxes go to the states. Gas taxes don't do anything about congestion, whereas mileage-based user fees can solve all of these problems. Oregon has an experiment going. They're the first to experiment with mileage-based user fees. Starting July 1st, you could sign up for the experiment, and I was one of the first people to sign up, and they sent me this little gadget that plugs into my car. And now it keeps track of how many miles I drive. They actually sent me a notice that, how come you aren't driving? Did you disconnect the gadget? Because they knew I wasn't driving. Well, it turns out I live in such a rural area, there's no cell phone service, so they weren't getting a signal from me. But they figured out ways of doing this so that it protects your privacy. It only scores how much you drive, how many miles you drive, and then the money will go to the owners of the roads that you're driving on. When I drove to the airport yesterday, I drove on a private road, a Forest Service federal road, a county road, a state highway, and a city street. But all the gas taxes I pay go to the state, which doesn't share any of them with the private road owner or the federal government, and they share only a modest amount with the counties and the cities. So with a mileage-based user fee, my money will go to the road owners whose roads I'm driving on. Watch my website, which is called the Anti-Planner. Just Google Anti-Planner, and the first thing on the list, and I have updates on how this experiment is going. So in general, solve today's problems today. Don't build a lot of new infrastructure, especially if you have to go into debt to do it. If you do have to build anything, make sure it's dumb. Don't try to build smart infrastructure. Make it dumb, which means anything can go on it. Buses, cars, bicycles, whatever, rather than making it only for certain kinds of vehicles like buses or smart cars or whatever. I talk about all of these issues in detail in my book, Gridlock. I've got a whole chapter in my book, American Nightmare, on tax increment development districts, but I didn't bring any copies of American Nightmare with me. I did bring a few copies of a paper I wrote on tax increment financing for Cato. You can download my papers on the web for free. The book, Gridlock, and American Nightmare are both available for sale. You can get EPUB editions for $13. The list price is $25. You can't get my autograph on the EPUB. So if you want a hard copy book with my autograph, I'm selling copies of Gridlock today for $20. I have a paper on autonomous vehicles. I have a paper on rapid bus systems. I have papers on tax increment financing. So go to cato.org and look for me and download my papers. Now, I'm not sure how much time I have. One more advertisement. Every year, people who are concerned about these issues, transportation and land use and tax increment financing and buses and transit and so on, gather together in a different city in a group called the American Dream Coalition. And the next meeting is going to take place in Austin on November 6th to 8th. And we've done everything we can to make this an affordable conference. We're bringing together about 2 or 3 dozen of the world's leading experts on these transportation and land use issues, including Wendell Cox and Bob Poole, the Reason Foundation. and a bunch of others. So if you're really interested in these issues, I hope you'll think about going to this conference. Just go to AmericanDreamCoalition.org to find out about the conference. Go to Cato.org to get copies of my papers. Go to TI.org to look at my blog, which is called The Anti-Planner. Did I leave enough time for any questions? Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
With all this exciting new technology and what it means for us, I feel like I'm at the World's Fair here. What I wanted to ask you is how would the free market handle the infrastructure of roads? I want to hear your opinion, how it would handle it, who would build the roads, and so on.
Well, actually, in the 19th century, most roads in America were built privately, and they were tolled. And the few public roads that were built turned out to be poorly maintained. The private toll road operators tended to maintain their roads much better than the public. So the federal government built a road called the National Road, which went from Pittsburgh to, from Philadelphia through Pittsburgh to Indianapolis and a little beyond. And there were some private roads that competed with it. The private roads were the better ones to go on. The national road was very poorly maintained. When the railroads came along, the incentive for toll roads disappeared because railroads are so much better than going on a muddy toll road. And the railroads, unfortunately, created this aura of monopoly, and there was a lot of, they were offering transportation that was cheaper and faster than anything before, and people said it was overpriced. So they wanted more government regulation. They wanted to end the monopolies. So when the idea of building roads for cars came along, they said, well, we don't want the same kind of monopolies to happen, so we want the government to do it. And when they created the gas tax and funded the roads out of the gas taxes, the system actually worked pretty well. The interstate highway system is probably the largest and most successful public works project in history because it was funded entirely out of user fees, and it was funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. If people weren't driving, they weren't paying the user fees, and they wouldn't have had any money. But as the graph showed you, driving just grew by leaps and bounds because of the interstate highway system, and so it paid more than paid for itself out of user fees. When we start paying for roads out of taxes, then you get in trouble. Then they get to be poorly maintained. The state highways that are paid for out of user fees are much better maintained than the city and county roads that are paid for out of taxes. So I'm not as libertarian as some people. I don't think everything in the United States should be privatized. It's not necessary. What is necessary is to make sure that we get the incentives right. Make sure the incentives facing transit agencies, the incentives facing highway departments, and so on are right. And that means funding them out of user fees. So whether it's private or public, I think is another question. But if we get them funded out of user fees, everybody will be better off. Yes?
What are your thoughts on the rail runner that goes from, I think, Berlin to Santa Fe?
Well, I love trains, and I'm looking forward to riding it someday. But it's a huge boondoggle. It's way more expensive than it can be justified. It's the thing is, a freight car weighs 50 tons, and you can load it with 100 tons of freight. And so it's much more fuel efficient to move freight by rail than by truck. And in the United States, 40% of our freight goes by rail, and about 25% goes by truck. In Europe, they decided to put passengers on the trains. And so only 16% of freight goes by rail and 75% goes by truck. So the trucks are really jamming up the roads, and they're wasting a lot of energy because rails are so much more fuel efficient. Rails are not fuel efficient for passengers. You take that 50-ton car, design it for passengers, you fill it with passengers, and you've got maybe 13 tons of passengers. On average, you've got about 6 tons of passengers, because it's usually half empty, and then the rail runner is even more than half empty. It's about 2/3 empty on average. So you've got about 4 tons of passengers on board. So you've got 50 tons of dead weight moving 4 tons of passengers. The pound per, dead weight per live weight ratio is a lot worse than for cars. So even though steel wheels are a little bit more fuel efficient than rubber tires, you lose out because of the pound per weight ratio. Rails have to be built much more precise, and so they're much more costly per mile, and they're much less convenient. So they're not sexy. They're slower, they're more expensive, they're less convenient, and safe. They might be safe, as long as you're not off the train, but when you're on the train, they're safe. Yeah.
You were saying that a bottleneck in some of the public transportation systems is exchanging money and things like that, buying tickets, getting on. Is there any transfer of knowledge from companies such as Uber, which does everything through their little apps and there's no money exchange at all, through these public transportation systems to help them streamline their processes?
Well, it's funny. Back in the 1970s, San Jose decided to create Uber. They created a public transit system where the transit vehicles would come and pick you up. They didn't have the internet then, so you had to telephone a telephone exchange and ask for it to come and pick you up. Then it would drop you off at your destination. And it was just like Uber. Now the vehicle that would pick you up might have 5 other passengers on board. So it wasn't exclusively for you like a taxi would be. It would be shared rides. And the system was too successful. The telephone exchange was jammed, and 2 out of 3 people couldn't even get in to use the system. And then the taxi drivers sued and said, "You're violating our legal monopoly to door-to-door transportation." And the courts agreed and ordered the transit agency to either quit offering the service or pay the taxi drivers $50 million. So they quit offering the service. There's no reason why Uber should have to pay the transit agencies, which are extremely inefficient, any money at all. It would just encourage them to be more inefficient. But if a transit agency really wanted to be more efficient, instead of fighting Uber, it should jump on the Uber bandwagon and try to provide that kind of a service. I don't think it should be a legal monopoly. In Oregon, transit agencies are legal monopolies, and a woman who was taking people from a senior center to a grocery store and asking for gas money was ordered to stop doing it because she was violating the transit monopoly. So no monopolies, allow for private entry, see if the transit industry can compete. Megabus, as I said before, was originally a public transit agency, and today is one of the 3 or 4 largest ground transportation companies in the world. So they can compete if we give them the right incentives.
All right, thank you, Randal.
Thank you.
Thanks for spending part of your time with us. If you want to get Randal's autograph on a book or buy a book, or I know Steve, he'll be outside where the check-in desk is, handing out paraphernalia and getting signatures and whatnot for people who are concerned about the bus rapid transit. So thanks again, and we'll see you hopefully on November the 4th.
Where do I get a shirt like that?